Hello, kindly people of YouTube, Punk Rock Fairy Princess here. And yes, we're talking about Game of Thrones again. With the final season starting, I thought I'd do a video on one of my favorite Game of Thrones theories. Before we start, I won't be mentioning anything from the newest episode until the very end of the video, and I'll do a warning before I do so. So don't worry too much about getting Season 8 spoilers throughout the majority of this video. Alrighty, here we go. Jon Snow is not in love with Daenerys. I think that's one of the most controversial things I've said on this channel yet. This is fun. Okay. But yeah, I'm pretty sure that Jon is not in love with Daenerys. I mean, I think he's attracted to her. I mean, who wouldn't be? But I think he's using her attraction to him to his advantage. That's right, this video is drawing heavily upon the political Jon theory, which, if you're not aware of it, is basically a theory that says that Jon is much more politically savvy than we give him credit for, and that he's got this whole plan running behind the scenes. So, one of the most important things that Jon learns in Season 6 is that Sansa is extremely politically capable, and that he needs to listen to her. I think he's learned from Sansa, and I can imagine that by the beginning of Season 7, they've had a bunch of conversations of what they've been through, and I'm assuming Sansa has imparted some political knowledge upon Jon. So when the Raven from Tyrion arrives, he asks for her advice first, since she knows him better than anyone in Winterfell. However, as we know from this scene...
Send a Raven north. Tell Jon Snow that his queen invites him to come to Dragonstone. And bend the knee.
Daenerys wants Jon to bend the knee, not just become an ally. Jon begins to realize this as soon as he arrives in Dragonstone. They're asked to hand over their weapons, and their boat is taken away. Jon realizes immediately that he has been deceived by Tyrion, and at this point he's probably already regretting showing up there. But he decides to make the best of it, manages a perfectly genuine smile to Missandei, and they continue on. Notice here how Missandei and Tyrion barely react when Drogon flies over. This indicates to me that this was planned beforehand as a kind of intimidation strategy to Jon. But I think that because Jon is so, like, shaken and amazed by, like, the fact that they're fucking dragons, that he doesn't really notice this. So you can tell from the very beginning of the meeting with Dany that Jon is uncomfortable. Like, we have known throughout the season that Jon is uncomfortable in these types of situations. He doesn't like these official proceedings. He's much too practical and down to earth to really, like, get into all the pomp and circumstance. And this is where he realizes that this is definitely a bend the knee situation, not a let's become allies situation. And political Jon, I don't think, has quite emerged at this point yet. Jon still thinks that he can make an alliance with Dany, using his rapport with Tyrion to convince them that the White Walkers exist. However, unfortunately, this is not how the meeting ends up going. Some people said that he's, like, in awe of her, but look at his face. He's not falling in love. He's not even impressed. He's frustrated. He was deceived in the nature of this meeting, and now he's basically a prisoner on the island. At this point, Jon just wants to go home. He's not going to bend the knee, and his people need him. Ironically, it is Tyrion that first gives Jon the advice that will eventually lead to political Jon.
Instead, she stayed where she was and saved many people from horrible fates. Some of whom are on this island with us right now. While you're our guest here, you might consider asking them what they think of the Mad King's daughter.
Jon figures out the way to figure out how to talk to Dany and, like, make her like him at least, is to talk to her followers. In the next conversation between Jon and Dany, they're still very confrontational. Jon is frustrated, and he's still his way too honest for politics self.
You know I'm not going to let Cersei stay on the Iron Throne.
I never expected that you would.
And I haven't changed my mind about which kingdoms belong to that throne.
I haven't either.
But you can tell that Dany is trying to get to know Jon better.
I named them for my brothers, Viserys and Rhaegar. They're both gone now. You lost 2 brothers as well.
And as we see, Jon is reticent to do so. He's trying to know things about Dany so he can get her to believe him, but he doesn't want her to know things about him. This may be because he doesn't want her to do the same things that he's trying to do to her. Or it could also just be that he doesn't actually want a real relationship with her. Like, he just needs an alliance. That's all he cares about. And we can see here that Dany is starting to like Jon. She looks back at him with, like, some interest when he walks away from this conversation. And this moment here with Missandei pretty much solidifies that she likes him. Missandei is like her best friend, and that look, we all know what that look means.
I wanted you to see it before we start hacking it to bits.
In this scene, Jon is trying a new approach. He shows the proof of the White Walker's existence, and he draws historical parallels. And also notice how he isolates her from the rest of her political advisors. It's just the two of them in the cave. He also initiates physical contact with her here. And I did a little bit of research on how to persuade people, and apparently inobtrusive physical contact is important when trying to persuade someone. He thinks that he's gotten through to her at this point.
I will fight for you. I will fight for the North. When you bend the knee.
But again, he hasn't. Then we come to the scene on the beach. Jon is clearly uncomfortable with the entire situation. He's just like, I'm a go. I feel like this is a private thing. I'ma just, yes, no, okay, I'll stay. He also sees her berating Tyrion really publicly and seems either confused or concerned about it. He's like, does this happen a lot? Like, does she do this on a regular basis? And this is where the shift of power towards Jon starts. Dany turns to Jon for advice. He's been there for a couple days? And she turns from her advisors that she's had for a long time to the newcomer. Tyrion is surprised and concerned by this. Varys and Missandei also have similar reactions. At this point, Jon is starting to understand how to get to Dany. He has to tell her that she's special, that she's different from the other rulers of the Seven Kingdoms. Her speech when they met is pretty evident of that, as well as her pride in having the first dragons in centuries. She wants to be different. She wants to be the new, different ruler that brings them into a new age. She wants to crush the wheel. So what does he say?
I never thought that dragons would exist again. No one did. The people who follow you know that you made something impossible happen. Maybe that helps them believe that you can make other impossible things happen. Build a world that's different from the shit one they've always known. But if you use them to melt castles and burn cities, you're not different.
This visibly hurts her feelings. And so he knows that how much she cares about this, and this is how to get to her. She wants to be special, to be revered, to fight the bad guy. In the East, that goal was easy. The bad guys were obviously the slavers. Jon will use this knowledge to his advantage in the future. Then we have this conversation with Davos.
I think she has a good heart. A good heart? I've noticed you staring at a good heart.
An interesting thing throughout the season is that we are constantly told by other people how Jon is feeling. In this case, Davos says that he's noticed Jon checking Dany out. And then in a later scene, we see Tyrion saying that Jon is in love with Dany.
It's interesting, these heroes you name. Drogo, Jorah, Dario, even this Jon Snow. They all fell in love with you.
But the thing is, even though everyone's saying this about him, we don't get very many signs from Jon about this. If you want to know more about this general thing, the lawyer that was promised on Tumblr has this whole post about how Jon's POV is obscured throughout the season, which I found really interesting, and I feel like I don't understand it enough to actually get into it here, but you guys should really check it out. Then there's this scene. Where Jon makes his first real move on Dany. Why else would he do this? It's clear from the following conversation that Jon does not have the highest opinion on dragons.
They're beautiful, aren't they?
Wasn't the word I was thinking of, but yes, they are. Gorgeous beasts.
So it's not like he just wanted to go over and pet the dragon. He's trying a new approach, impressing her. The audience knows that in the past that this has worked. I mean, Dario caught her eye mainly because he did a bunch of reckless shit to impress her. And we also know that Jon doesn't do reckless stuff just, for funsies. He's not like, I'm gonna just go over and pet this fire-breathing dragon that I think is very dangerous. In the following conversation with Dany, he messes up for a second. He calls the dragons beasts, showing how he really feels about them. Then Jorah shows up, and he sort of gives Jon an example of someone who Dany likes. Jorah is subservient and praises Dany constantly, much like Missandei does, and Missandei and Jorah are two of the people Dany seems to like the most. And does Jon really look jealous here?
Jon Snow, this is Sir Jorah Mormont.
We've been given no indication that he would be jealous, like he doesn't like her at this point. Even if you believe that he might fall for her later, at this point, he doesn't. He's just observing. He's seeing what does Jorah do that makes Dany like him so much. Then comes a small council meeting. Jon has just found out that Bran and Arya have returned to Winterfell and he wants to go home. Nothing he's done has convinced Dany of helping him. Sure, he's got Dragonglass now and the Alliance doesn't seem to be going anywhere, so he's like, I might as well just go home. But then Tyrion comes up with the White Hunt plan, which admittedly, I mean, a lot of people have said this, it's objectively a terrible plan. Which may just be part of Tyrion's strategy, or maybe just be bad writing, I don't know. But Jon realizes that this may be a way to convince Dany of the danger that the White Walkers pose. Why else would he agree to it? Jon doesn't care about convincing Cersei of anything. He never has, but he realizes that the only way to convince Dany is to convince Cersei, so she'll have a ceasefire. So then Dany will go with him, right? And this is reflected in a later scene with Tormund and the rest of the crew.
And you need to convince the one with the dragons, or the one who fucks a brother?
Both.
His attitude about Dany and Cersei's conflict hasn't changed at all. He doesn't see them as different. His going north of the Wall is just as much about convincing Dany as it is about convincing Cersei, if not more so for Dany. The only reason he cares about Cersei is that if she doesn't do a ceasefire, then Dany won't help him, and that's his entire goal.
I put my trust in you. A stranger. Because I knew it was the best chance for my people, for all our people. Now I'm asking you to trust in a stranger. Because it's our best chance.
Within this scene, him calling himself a stranger is also interesting. Like, they've probably been living in the same castle for weeks now, and he still doesn't seem to have very much of a personal connection with Dany. This is reflected again in their goodbye on the beach. Dany gives a heartfelt goodbye to Jon. We already know she's falling in love. And so does Tyrion in the background, and he's concerned about it. He's already seen how much Jon is gaining influence over Dany, and he's worried about how this might end. And then Jon's goodbye is much more formal, almost emotionless and detached.
I wish you good fortune in the wars to come, Your Grace.
And then, as they push off from the beach, there's a clear comparison between Jon and Jorah. Jorah looks back, and Jon does not. And Dany seems disappointed by this. There are loads of examples of characters who care about each other looking back as the other leaves. I mean, we've got Jon and Sansa earlier this season, we've got Ned and Kat, we've got Jaime and Brienne. Even Dany looks back at Jon in this earlier scene, indicating to the audience that she's starting to fall for him. But Jon doesn't look back. Beyond the wall, of course, you have the previously mentioned scene with Tormund and the crew, as well as Jon saying this to them as they trek north.
So, you met this dragon queen, huh? And
she'll only fight beside us if I bend the knee.
He also shows no jealousy towards Jorah, which is interesting because the previous two people fighting for Dany's affections, Jorah and Daario, did have a pretty tense relationship, to say the least. Back in Dragonstone, Tyrion and Dany have a little fireside chat.
It's interesting, these heroes you name. Drogo, Jorah, Daario, even this Jon Snow. They all fell in love with you.
Jon Snow's not in love with me.
When Tyrion says that Jon is in love with Dany, she immediately brushes it off. She knows he's not in love with her. Men have been in love with her before. We've got Daario and Jorah, and she knows that this is not it. And we also know that she's disappointed about this. Tyrion's next line is especially interesting.
Oh, my mistake. I suppose he stares at you longingly because he's hopeful for a successful military alliance.
It's supposed to sound absurd. Jon, military alliance? Pfft, as if. Except that's exactly what Jon wants. It's one of the main reasons he came. He wanted Dragonglass, which he is successfully mining, and he wants a military alliance. And because this is Game of Thrones, these kind of offhand comments are important. There's also a similar scene back in season 3 between Shay and Sansa.
Men only want one thing from a pretty girl. Littlefinger is not in love with me.
We know now that Littlefinger was using Sansa to gain power, and he was using her trust in him to manipulate her. Then we get to the knee bending scene. No, the bending of the knee scene, whatever. Before we really get into it, I'd like to point out that there's no physical knee bending in this scene at all. Of course, Jon is injured and there's a joke about it, but in a show so focused on symbolism and foreshadowing, and in a season so focused on the bending of the knee, it's interesting that Jon never actually physically bends the knee to Dany. Credit to @the Lost Satellites on Tumblr for that whole thing. Jon is very in control of his emotions and his words in this scene, and he seems to be in a lot of different scenes with Dany. He speaks slowly, with pauses, and it's played off as romantic, but I don't think so. When people talk very slowly and very measured, you get the feeling that they're lying because they're thinking so hard about what they're saying, they don't want to say it wrong. This is in comparison with someone he's like, with other people he talks to, like Sansa. When he talks to Sansa, he stumbles over his words. He says the wrong thing sometimes. But in talking to Dany, he knows exactly what he wants to say. And he thinks hard about it to make sure he says the right thing. But you may argue, he only bends the knee to Dany after she says he'll fight for him, so it can't be in pursuit of an alliance. Which is a fair argument. Sure, Dany is more motivated to fight the White Walkers now, but can Jon really trust her? She's been against this idea the whole time, and she hasn't said anything about, not being worried about Cersei anymore. Jon needs to solidify her trust. As he said numerous times before, she won't fight for him unless he bends the knee. But why now? If he's so smart, why didn't he bend the knee as soon as he arrived in Dragonstone? But if he'd done that, then Dany could have just been like, okay, great, get your men, we're gonna attack King's Landing right now. And he would have been like, well, shit, that was not my intention at all. This is the perfect time. Dany is vulnerable and on his side for once. So this is when he bends the knee. And the reasoning he gives for bending the knee is also super vague.
It'll come to see you for what you are.
That could mean honestly anything. And also at this point, he's never said anything positive about her leading abilities. He said that he thinks she's a good person, that she has good intentions, but he's never said anything about how he thinks she'd be a good ruler of the North. He's even expressed distaste with her methods.
And I have fewer enemies today than I did yesterday. You're not sure how you feel about that?
No, I'm not.
After Dany leaves the room, we see Jon staring at the ceiling, and he doesn't look particularly happy. You'd think that now that he has gotten what he's been pursuing for the past couple weeks, presumably, Dany has said that she'll fight the White Walkers with him. But he's not happy. He's guilty. He's ashamed. Because he just lied to her. We get a neat little bit of possible foreshadowing at the meeting in the Dragon Pit.
I ask it only of Ned Stark's son. I know Ned Stark's son will be true to his word.
This is important for two reasons. We, the audience, know that 1, Jon isn't Ned Stark's son, and 2, Ned Stark has lied so many times about very big things. And then this is followed by Jon, the Northern Fool, telling the truth. We know Jon's lied before. His entire northern excursion to infiltrate the army of the Free Folk, he lied so many times during that whole thing. So why doesn't he lie here? Well, first of all, he knows that Cersei will never keep her word, no matter what he says. I mean, presumably he and Sansa have had a ton of conversations, and don't trust Cersei seems like a pretty big thing that Sansa would have told him. So his decision has nothing to do with Cersei. Remember, he doesn't care about Cersei. He cares about having Dany's support. Instead of being motivated by the futile hope that Cersei might keep her word, Jon decides to strengthen his connection with Dany. And does it work? Well, look at her reaction.
I cannot serve 2 queens. And I've already pledged myself to Queen Daenerys of House Targaryen.
Even though though she criticizes the decision later, she looks pretty damn impressed right here. The lore that was promised on Tumblr has an interesting theory here. They believe that Jon's plan in this case would have been to speak to Cersei and tell her the truth about him pretending to have bent the knee to Dany. It would have been in Cersei's interest then to pretend to go along with the truce, knowing that Jon would not be supporting Dany afterwards when Dany comes back to claim the Iron Throne. That way Jon gets Dany's support without the threat of Cersei from the south. And this theory gives a whole other meaning behind this bit.
I did this. I should go.
She'll definitely murder you.
Anyway, then Dany and Jon have a conversation as Tyrion goes to speak to his sister. Dany talks again about being special and how dragons make her special. And as we know, Jon is not a super huge fan of these dragons, but he knows how important being special is to Dany, so he goes along with it.
We weren't extraordinary without them. We were just like everyone else.
You're not like everyone else.
After all this, Dany is still worried that Cersei will take back land as she goes north. Jon is clearly frustrated at this point, as he has been for most of the time. And he realizes that he has tried every single possible approach to get Dany on his side, except for one. Right, so Cersei agrees on the truce, kind of, and Team Dany discusses traveling plans. Now this is the scene where everyone realizes just how much influence Jon has over Dany. Jon suggests that Dany travel with him by ship to Winterfell. This is clearly not the best option. As pointed out by Jorah, Dany flying to Winterfell is the safest way to go.
It's important for the Northerners to see us as allies. If we sail to White Harbor together, I think it sends a better message.
Now this may be partially serious from Jon. He knows that the North will not accept a southern ruler very easily. However, it's mostly to get Dany alone with him. Tyrion and Jorah share a look. They clearly see what's going on here, as do many of the other people in the meeting. In a previous scene, Tyrion had this to say to Jorah.
Our queen needs you.
And this is what he meant. Jon has so much influence over Dany, and Tyrion is rightfully suspicious of his intentions. When Dany agrees, Jon doesn't look particularly happy about it, which is weird. It was his idea. Why does he look guilty? Because he realizes what he's gonna have to do. Something that Jon says in the next scene is very telling, because this is the scene immediately after they have discussed the traveling plans. And then he says this to Theon.
I've done plenty of things that I regret.
I mean, what else could he be talking about? We don't know of any other morally dubious decisions that Jon has made lately. Then we have the boat sex scene, which, if it's intended to be the first big romantic scene of the big romantic couple of the show, it is sure done strangely. There's hardly any lead up. There's not even a first kiss. And it's honestly not very romantic at all. Plus, there's Bran's narration over top of it, in which we find out that Jon is currently having sex with his aunt, which takes away any possible romance that there was to begin with. Right, and then we get to season 8, so spoilers beyond this point for season 8, episode 1. The scene where Dany and Jon ride dragons intrigued me. In the beginning it seems like a cute scene, and Jon and Dany actually have a little bit of chemistry throughout it. And then we get to this point.
Don't be afraid.
Now either this is supposed to be a cute little, ooh, the dragons are protective of their mother scene, or it's something more. And since this is Game of Thrones we're talking about, I'm leaning towards the latter. Now there hasn't been very much to indicate throughout the show that dragons are particularly intuitive to people's intentions and motivations, but honestly, what else could it be? What other reason could Drogon have to be so threatening towards Jon than if Drogon somehow senses that Jon's intentions toward Dany are not entirely honorable? So that is my case as to why I think that Jon is not in love with Dany and is actually using her attraction to him and her falling in love with him to his advantage. Now, does this make Jon a bad person? I mean, this is Game of Thrones, we're talking about pretty much everyone is a bad person, but it depends on your perspective. Jon clearly feels guilty about it, but he is doing it all for the greater good. So I hope y'all found this video interesting. I obviously didn't come up with all of this on my own. I found out about the political Jon theory on Tumblr, and it made me look at the show in a very different way because I hadn't really been looking at it critically beforehand. Yes, if you're interested in this theory, I highly recommend checking out the Lore That Was Promised blog on Tumblr. I found their posts very interesting and informative. There's other blogs on Tumblr that clearly talk about this, but that was the one I looked at the most to, yes, learn about this theory. The video will probably be posted after the second episode comes out, so who knows what has happened at this point. But, yes, thank you for watching. I'll see y'all later. Bye!